The storm came to New Orleans like a fist through silk. It was October, and the air carried that thick, wet heat that made everything feel alive and rotting at the same time. The Mississippi churned brown and angry, swallowing pieces of the levee while merchants in the French Quarter cursed and tied down their shutters. Out past the cobblestones and iron balconies, where the city frayed into dirt roads and pine forests, sat Harrow Parish, a wooden chapel with a crooked steeple and a reverend who spoke English like a whip-crack. Clara stood in the back of the sanctuary, her hands raw from scrubbing the floorboards. The chapel smelled like lye soap, candle wax, and something else, something sour that clung to the velvet curtains behind the pulpit. She knew that smell. It lived in her clothes now. "Sister Clara." She didn't turn. She knew his voice the way you know the sound of a door locking. Reverend Samuel Whitaker stood at the altar, his black coat buttoned to the throat, his face smooth and pale as tallow. He was 43 years old, originally from Charleston, and he preached with the kind of fervor that made women weep and men nod along like they'd discovered something true. He had a wife back in South Carolina. Everyone knew that. But she never came to Louisiana. Some said she was sickly, others said she knew better. "Yes, Reverend," Clara said quietly, wringing out the rag in her hands. "The Lord's house must be spotless," he said, walking slowly down the aisle. His boots echoed on the wood. "Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. Cleanliness is next to godliness. You know this." "Yes, Reverend." He stopped a few feet from her, close enough that she could see the small red veins in his eyes. He hadn't slept well. That meant he'd been drinking again, the communion wine he kept locked in his study. "You've been distracted," he said softly. "I've noticed." Clara kept her eyes on the floor. She was 26 years old, born on a sugar plantation outside Baton Rouge, sold twice before she was 15. She'd learned early that the safest place to look was down. "I apologize, Reverend. I'll do better." "You will." He reached out and touched her chin, tilting her face up. His fingers were cold. "Because you are one of the chosen, Clara. You understand that, don't you? Not everyone gets to serve in the house of God." She swallowed. "Yes, Reverend." "Good." He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Come to my study after evening prayer. We'll discuss your spiritual progress." He let her go and walked back toward the altar, humming a hymn under his breath. Clara stood there, rag in hand, and felt the walls close in. Harrow Parish wasn't like the Catholic churches in the French Quarter, with their stone saints and Latin prayers. It was Protestant, fire and brimstone Protestant, the kind that had been spreading through the South like kudzu. Reverend Whitaker had arrived 3 years ago with a leather Bible and a mandate from a missionary society in Charleston. He'd built the chapel with money from plantation owners who wanted their slaves to hear about obedience and heaven in the same sentence. There were about 60 enslaved people who attended services, some from nearby plantations, others from households in the city. They sat in the back rows, on benches without cushions, while the white congregation sat up front. The sermons were always the same. "Suffer now, rejoice later, be meek, be grateful. God sees your chains and calls them holy." Clara had heard it all 1,000 times, but lately something had shifted. The Reverend's attention had turned toward a new face in the congregation, a girl named Lisette, 12 years old, with skin like polished mahogany and eyes that still held some light. She worked in the kitchens of a merchant's house on Chartres Street, and every Sunday she sat in the back row with her hands folded in her lap, singing hymns in a voice so pure it made the old women cry. Clara had seen the way Whitaker looked at her. She'd seen it before. She knew what came next. That evening, after the last hymn had been sung and the congregation had filed out into the rain, Clara made her way to the Reverend's study. It was a small room off the side of the chapel, lined with bookshelves and a desk cluttered with papers. A single candle burned on the windowsill, casting long shadows across the walls. Whitaker was sitting behind the desk, pouring himself a glass of wine. "Close the door," he said without looking up. Clara did. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." She sat. For a long moment he said nothing. He just sipped his wine and watched her with that same cold smile. "You know why you're here," he said finally. Clara's throat tightened. "To repent." "To repent," he repeated, nodding slowly. "That's right, because we are all sinners, Clara, every one of us, even you." He stood up and walked around the desk, standing behind her chair. She could feel his breath on the back of her neck. "The flesh is weak," he murmured, "but the spirit can be made strong, through discipline, through submission." His hand rested on her shoulder. Clara closed her eyes and let herself go somewhere else. Somewhere far from this room, far from his voice, far from the shame that clung to her like a second skin. She thought about the river, she thought about the sky, she thought about running. But she didn't run, not yet. When she finally left the study, the chapel was dark. The storm outside had grown louder, rattling the shutters and making the candlelight flicker. Clara stood in the empty sanctuary, staring at the wooden cross above the altar. She didn't pray. She'd stopped praying a long time ago. Instead, she thought about Lisette, about the way the girl's hands trembled when she sang, about the way Whitaker's eyes followed her every Sunday. Clara had been that girl once. She knew how it started. She knew how it ended. And she knew that if she didn't do something, it would happen again. The next morning, Clara went to the market in the French Quarter. It was crowded and loud, full of vendors shouting in French and Spanish, selling everything from oysters to iron nails. She moved through the stalls with her head down, clutching the few coins she'd saved from mending clothes for the other enslaved women. She stopped at a butcher's stall, where a man with a blood-stained apron was sharpening knives. "I'll help you," he grunted. Clara glanced around, then leaned in close. "I need a knife, a good one." The butcher raised an eyebrow. "What for?" "Cutting meat." He studied her for a moment, then shrugged. "2 bits." She handed him the coins and took the knife. It was heavy, with a wooden handle and a blade that gleamed in the sunlight. She slipped it into the folds of her skirt and walked away. That Sunday, the storm that had been brewing all week finally broke. The rain came down in sheets, turning the dirt roads into rivers of mud. Inside Harrow Parish, the congregation huddled together, shaking off their wet coats and whispering prayers. Reverend Whitaker stood at the pulpit, his voice booming over the sound of thunder. "Brothers and sisters," he shouted, "we gather here today in the midst of the storm, but we do not fear, for the Lord is our shepherd, and he will guide us through the darkness." The congregation murmured in agreement. Clara sat in the back row, her hands folded in her lap. Beneath her apron, the knife pressed cold against her skin. She watched Lisette, 2 rows ahead, singing with the others. The girl's voice was shaking. Clara took a slow breath. She thought about the river. She thought about the sky. She thought about what it would feel like to be free. Not someday, not in heaven, but right now. And then she stood up. The congregation didn't notice at first. They were too focused on the sermon, too caught up in the hymn. But as Clara walked down the aisle, heads began to turn. Whitaker stopped mid-sentence. "Sister Clara?" She didn't answer. She just kept walking, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. When she reached the pulpit, she knelt before him, her head bowed. "Reverend," she whispered, "I need to confess." He smiled, that same cold smile. "Of course, child. The Lord welcomes all who seek forgiveness." He placed his hand on her head, his fingers tangling in her hair. And that's when Clara reached beneath her apron. The knife came out clean and fast. She looked up at him, her eyes meeting his for the first time. "You said the Lord sees everything," she whispered. And then she drove the blade into his throat. The hymn stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. the kind of silence that feels like the world has forgotten how to breathe. Then came the scream. It started with Mrs. Beaumont, a plantation owner's wife who sat in the third row with her silk fan and pearl necklace. Her voice split the air like glass breaking, high and sharp and endless. Others joined her, men shouting, women sobbing, children crying. The sanctuary erupted into chaos, but Clara didn't move. She knelt before the pulpit, the knife still in her hand, watching as Reverend Samuel Whitaker stumbled backward, his fingers clutched at his throat, blood pouring between them in thick, dark streams. His mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. He tried to speak, tried to call for help, tried to condemn her one last time, but all that came out was a wet, choking gurgle. He fell to his knees, his eyes wide with something that might have been surprise or might have been understanding. For 3 years he had stood at this altar and spoken about Judgment Day, about the Lord's wrath, about sinners meeting their fate. Now he was meeting his own. Clara watched him die. She watched the way his body twitched and spasmed. She watched the blood soak into the white altar cloth, spreading like spilled wine. She watched until his eyes went glassy and still, until the last breath rattled out of his chest. Then she stood up. The congregation had pressed themselves against the walls, as far from her as they could get. Some were already running for the doors, shoving past each other in their panic. Others stood frozen, their faces pale with horror. Clara looked down at the knife in her hand. It was heavier now, slick with blood. She'd expected to feel something, guilt, maybe, or fear, or the wild rush of freedom. But all she felt was tired. So tired. He was going to do it again, she said quietly. No one answered. She turned and looked at the back of the chapel, where Lisette sat huddled in the corner, her eyes wide and wet with tears. The girl was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. Clara walked toward her slowly, carefully, like approaching a frightened animal. Several people gasped and moved away. Someone, she didn't see who, whispered, "Stay back from her." But Clara ignored them. She crouched down in front of Lisette and reached out, gently touching the girl's face. "You're safe now," Clara whispered. "You hear me? He can't hurt you." Lisette's lips trembled. You killed him." "Yes. They're going to hang you." Clara smiled, and it was a sad, broken thing. "I know." She stood up and turned back toward the altar. Reverend Whitaker's body lay crumpled at the base of the pulpit, his blood pooling on the floorboard she'd scrubbed just that morning. The wooden cross above him seemed to lean forward, as if trying to see what had been done in its shadow. Outside, the storm raged on. Thunder shook the chapel walls, and rain hammered against the roof like 1,000 desperate fists. Through the windows, Clara could see the sky, black and roiling and alive with lightning. She walked back to the center of the sanctuary and stood beneath the cross. "Now he will hear me," she said to no one in particular. Then she dropped the knife. It clattered on the floor, spinning once before coming to rest in a pool of rainwater that had leaked through the roof. Behind her, she heard footsteps, heavy boots on wet wood, men's voices, urgent and angry. "Someone get the constable! Don't let her leave! Sweet Jesus, she's mad!" But Clara didn't turn around. She just stood there, staring up at the cross, listening to the rain and the thunder and the sound of her own heartbeat slowing down. She thought about her mother, who had died giving birth to her on a plantation she'd never learned the name of. She thought about the men who had bought and sold her like cattle. She thought about every night in Whitaker's study, every time she'd swallowed her shame and let him call it God's will. She thought about freedom, and then she started to sing. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. Her voice was rough and low, nothing like Lisette's pure soprano, but it carried through the chapel, cutting through the chaos and the screams. "That saved a wretch like me." The congregation fell silent, staring at her like she was a ghost. "I once was lost, but now am found." Loom, the chapel doors burst open. 3 men rushed in, the constable, a barrel-chested Frenchman named Auguste Delacroix, and 2 of his deputies. They were soaked from the rain, their faces grim and determined. Was blind, but now I see. Delacroix stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene, the body, the blood, the woman standing beneath the cross, singing a hymn like it was Sunday morning, and nothing had happened at all. Mon Dieu, he breathed. Clara finished the verse and let the last note hang in the air. Then she turned to face him. I'm ready, she said simply. Delacroix approached her slowly, his hand on the pistol at his belt. Did you do this? Yes. Why? Clara looked at him, really looked at him, the way she'd never been allowed to look at white men before. Because he was a liar and a devil, and someone had to stop him. Delacroix's jaw tightened. He glanced at the body, then back at her. You'll hang for this. I know. He pulled out a pair of iron shackles and reached for her wrists. Clara held them out willingly. The metal was cold and heavy, but she'd worn chains before. These felt no different. As Delacroix led her toward the door, Clara looked back one last time. The congregation was still pressed against the walls, watching her with a mixture of fear and something else, something that looked almost like awe. Lisette was still in the corner, tears streaming down her face. But she wasn't looking at Clara with horror anymore. She was looking at her with gratitude. Clara nodded once, a small gesture that said, live, be free, remember. Then she turned and walked out into the storm. They locked her in the parish jail, a small stone building behind the courthouse on Royal Street. It was damp and dark, with a single barred window that looked out onto an alley full of garbage and rats. There was a wooden bench, a bucket for waste, and nothing else. Clara sat on the bench and listened to the rain. Hours passed, then days. She lost track of time in the darkness, measuring her existence by the meals that were shoved through the slot in the door, thin gruel and stale bread that tasted like ash. Sometimes she heard voices outside, people arguing, someone demanding justice, someone else calling her a murderer, a savage, an abomination. Once she heard a woman's voice, soft and uncertain, saying, maybe he deserved it. Maybe she was right. That voice was quickly silenced. On the 3rd day, a man came to see her. He was tall and thin, with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers. He introduced himself as Etienne Moreau, a lawyer from the French Quarter. I don't have money for a lawyer, Clara said. I'm not asking for money. Moreau pulled out a small notebook and a pencil. I want to know what happened, the truth. Clara studied him. He didn't look like the kind of man who would care about the truth. But there was something in his eyes, a curiosity, maybe, or a kind of quiet anger that reminded her of her own. So she told him. She told him about the first time Whitaker had called her to his study. She told him about the things he'd said, the things he'd done, the way he'd justified it all with scripture and sermons. She told him about the other women, at least 3 that she knew of, maybe more, who had disappeared after refusing him. She told him about Lisette and the way Whitaker had started to look at her and the terrible certainty that it was going to happen again. Moreau listened without interrupting. He took notes in his small, cramped handwriting, his face growing darker with every word. When she finished, he set down his pencil and looked at her. They're going to hang you, he said quietly. You know that, don't you? Yes. Even if I tell them everything you just told me, even if I bring witnesses, even if I prove that Whitaker was a monster. He paused. You're a slave who killed a white man in a church. There's no jury in Louisiana that will find you innocent. Clara nodded. She'd known this from the moment she'd picked up the knife. But, Moreau continued, I can make sure people know why you did it. I can make sure your story gets told. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled. A real smile this time. Small and sad, but genuine. Then tell it, she said. Tell them what he was. Tell them what all of them are. Moreau closed his notebook and stood up. I will. He left, and Clara was alone again. The trial lasted 3 hours. They held it in the courthouse on Royal Street, in a room packed with spectators. Plantation owners and merchants, housewives and clerks, all crammed together to see the slave woman who had murdered a reverend. Some came out of outrage. Others came out of curiosity. A few came hoping to hear something that would confirm what they'd always suspected about Samuel Whitaker. Clara was brought in shackles, flanked by 2 guards. She wore the same blood-stained dress from Sunday, because no one had thought to give her a clean one. She didn't care. She walked into that courtroom with her head high, her eyes clear, and her hands steady. The prosecutor was a man named Charles Livingston, a silver-haired lawyer who had made his career defending the rights of property owners. He stood before the jury, 12 white men, all of them landowners or businessmen, and painted Clara as a savage, a monster, a cautionary tale about what happened when slaves were given too much freedom. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice ringing through the courtroom, "this woman has committed the most heinous crime imaginable. She has murdered a man of God in his own church, before a congregation of innocent worshippers. She has spilled blood on holy ground. She has defied not only the laws of man, but the laws of God himself." He pointed at Clara. "Look at her. She shows no remorse, no shame, no fear of judgment. She is a creature of violence, and if we do not act swiftly and decisively, we invite chaos into our streets." The jury nodded along, their faces grim. Then it was Moreau's turn. He stood up slowly, adjusting his spectacles, and approached the jury with his notebook in hand. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "I will not insult your intelligence by claiming that Clara did not kill Reverend Whitaker. She did. She admits it freely. But before you condemn her to death, I ask that you listen to why." He opened his notebook and began to read. He told them about the nights in Whitaker's study. He told them about the other women who had come forward, quietly, fearfully, to share their own stories. He told them about Lisette, and the way Whitaker had begun to groom her, and the terrible choice Clara had faced. Do nothing and watch another child be destroyed, or act and accept the consequences. "Reverend Whitaker," Moreau said, his voice growing stronger, "was not a man of God. He was a predator who used his position to abuse the women placed under his care. And when Clara saw him turning his attention toward a 12-year-old girl, she made a choice, not an easy choice, not a comfortable choice, but a human choice." The courtroom was silent. Moreau closed his notebook and looked at the jury. "You will condemn her. I know that. The law requires it. But I ask you to remember that there are different kinds of justice, and sometimes the law and justice are not the same thing." He sat down. The jury deliberated for 20 minutes. When they returned, the foreman, a plantation owner from Plaquemines Parish, stood and read the verdict. "Guilty." The judge, a weary-looking man named Philippe Duclos, banged his gavel. "Clara, you have been found guilty of murder. You will be hanged by the neck until dead, sentenced to be carried out at dawn 3 days hence. May God have mercy on your soul." Clara didn't flinch. As the guards led her away, she looked back at the courtroom one last time. Most of the faces were satisfied, relieved that justice had been served. But a few, just a few, looked uncertain, troubled, as if they'd heard something they couldn't unhear. Moreau caught her eye and nodded. She nodded back. They took her back to the jail, but this time they moved her to a different cell, one reserved for prisoners awaiting execution. It was even smaller than the first, with no window and no light except for the torch that burned in the hallway outside. Clara sat in the darkness and waited. On the second night, someone came to see her. At first, she thought it was Moreau again, but when the figure stepped into the torchlight, she saw that it was a woman, small and slight, with dark skin and eyes that gleamed like black glass. "Who are you?" Clara asked. The woman smiled. "My name is Marie. Some call me a healer, others call me something else." Clara had heard stories about women like this. Women who knew roots and herbs, who could read bones and see futures, who walked the line between the world of the living and the world of spirits. In the French Quarter, they called them traiteurs. On the plantations, they called them conjure women. "Why are you here?" Clara asked. Marie stepped closer to the bars. "Because I wanted to meet the woman who made a devil bleed." Clara said nothing. "They're going to hang you," Marie continued. "But that doesn't mean you have to die." What are you talking about?" Marie reached into her pocket and pulled out a small cloth bag tied with red thread. "Drink this. Tonight, when the guard brings your meal, it will slow your heart, make you cold. They'll think you're dead. And when they take your body to be buried, someone will be waiting to dig you up." Clara stared at the bag. "Why would you help me?" "Because what you did was brave, and because the world needs more brave women." Marie pressed the bag through the bars. "But you have to decide. You can die on the gallows and become a martyr, or you can live and become something else." Clara took the bag, feeling its weight in her palm. "What happens if I live? You run, far from here, and you never look back." For a long moment, Clara said nothing. She thought about the rope waiting for her. She thought about the satisfaction on Livingston's face. She thought about Lisette and the other women who would come after her, and the men who would continue to hurt them. Then she thought about the river, the sky, the feeling of being free. She looked up at Marie. "Thank you." Marie smiled. "Don't thank me yet. Just drink and trust." She disappeared back into the shadows, leaving Clara alone with the bag. That night, when the guard brought her meal, Clara poured the powder into her water and drank it down. It tasted bitter, like earth and ashes. Within minutes, her limbs grew heavy, her heartbeat slowed, the world began to fade. She lay down on the bench and closed her eyes, and waited. Clara woke to the sound of dirt hitting wood. For a moment, she didn't understand what was happening. Everything was dark, so dark she couldn't see her own hands. The air was thick and stale, and when she tried to move, her body felt sluggish and strange, like she was moving underwater. Then she realized she was in a coffin. Panic seized her chest. She tried to scream, but her throat was dry and her voice came out as a weak rasp. She pounded on the lid above her head, her fists striking the rough wood again and again. More dirt fell. The sound was muffled but unmistakable, shovelfuls of earth being thrown into a grave. "They're burying me. They think I'm dead." Marie's potion worked too well. Clara's mind raced. How long had she been unconscious? Hours? Days? She had no way of knowing. All she knew was that she was 6 feet underground in a pine box, and if she didn't get out soon, the potion that had saved her life would become her tomb. She took a slow breath, forcing herself to calm down. Panicking would use up the little air she had left. Think. The coffin was cheap. She could tell by the way the wood creaked when she moved. They wouldn't have wasted money on a good coffin for a slave, especially one condemned for murder. That meant the lid was probably nailed shut, but not with too many nails. If she could find a weak spot, maybe she could force it open. Clara braced her feet against the bottom of the coffin and pushed up with all her strength. The lid didn't budge. She tried again, harder this time, throwing her whole body against it. Something cracked, a small sound but promising. She kept pushing, kept fighting, even as her lungs began to burn and black spots danced in her vision. The wood splintered. One of the boards split down the middle. Dirt began to pour through the gap, cascading onto her face and chest. Clara didn't stop. She clawed at the opening, tearing at the wood with her fingernails until they bled. More dirt fell, heavier now, threatening to bury her alive even as she tried to escape, but she kept digging, up, always up. Her hands broke through the surface first. Cold night air rushed against her skin, the most beautiful thing she'd ever felt. She pulled herself up through the dirt, gasping and coughing, until her head emerged from the grave. The cemetery was dark and silent. Live oaks towered overhead. their branches draped with Spanish moss that swayed in the breeze. In the distance, she could see the lights of New Orleans flickering like distant stars. Clara dragged herself out of the grave and collapsed on the ground, her whole body shaking. She was covered in dirt from head to toe, her dress torn and filthy, her hands bleeding. But she was alive. She was alive. For a moment she just lay there, staring up at the sky. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in silver light. She could hear the river in the distance, and the sound of it made her think of freedom. Real freedom, not the kind that came after death. "You made it!" Clara jerked upright, her heart pounding. Marie emerged from behind one of the crypts, carrying a small lantern. She looked exactly as she had in the jail, small and calm and impossibly knowing. "How did you—" Clara began. "I told you someone would be waiting." Marie set down the lantern and pulled out a bundle of clothes. "Put these on. We need to leave before the gravedigger comes back." Clara took the clothes, a simple brown dress and a worn shawl, and changed quickly, not caring that Marie was watching. Her old dress was ruined anyway, stiff with dried blood and dirt. "Where are we going?" Clara asked. "Somewhere safe for now." Marie handed her a piece of bread and a water skin. "Eat. You'll need your strength." Clara ate ravenously, barely tasting the food. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the bread touched her tongue. Marie watched her with those dark, knowing eyes. "You're going to have to leave New Orleans. You know that, don't you?" "I know. They'll search for you. When they realize your grave is empty, they'll tear this city apart looking for the slave woman who came back from the dead." Marie paused. "Some will say you made a deal with the devil. Others will say you're a ghost. Either way, you can't stay here." Clara finished the bread and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "Where should I go?" "North. There are people who can help you, people who help runaways. But it's dangerous. If they catch you—" Marie didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Clara looked back at the open grave, at the splintered coffin half buried in dirt. She thought about how close she'd come to dying down there. How easy it would have been to just give up, to let the earth take her. But she hadn't given up, and she wasn't going to start now. "I'll go north," she said. "But first, I need to do something." Marie tilted her head. "What?" "I need to see Lisette. I need to make sure she's safe." Marie's expression darkened. "That's too dangerous. The girl lives in the French Quarter, in a house full of white people who would turn you in without a second thought. I don't care. Clara, I killed a man to protect her." Clara's voice was hard now, unyielding. "I'm not leaving this city until I know she's all right." Marie studied her for a long moment. Then she sighed and picked up the lantern. "You're either very brave or very foolish. I haven't decided which. Maybe both. Maybe." Marie started walking, gesturing for Clara to follow. "Come on. I know a way into the quarter that the constable's men don't watch. But we have to be quick." They moved through the cemetery like shadows, weaving between crypts and crumbling tombs. New Orleans buried its dead above ground because the water table was too high for traditional graves, which meant the cemetery was a maze of stone vaults and marble angels, all watching with blind eyes as Clara passed. She felt like a ghost herself, like something that had died and come back wrong. Maybe that's what she was now, not quite alive, not quite dead. Something in between. They left the cemetery through a gap in the iron fence and made their way into the city. The streets were empty at this hour, most people tucked safely in their beds, but Clara could hear sounds in the distance. Music from a tavern, laughter from a brothel, the occasional shout of a night watchman making his rounds. Marie led her through narrow alleys and back streets, places where the moonlight didn't reach and the shadows grew thick as smoke. Clara followed without question. She had no choice but to trust this woman, this stranger who had saved her life for reasons she still didn't fully understand. They reached the French Quarter just as church bells began to toll midnight. The houses here were tall and narrow, with wrought iron balconies and shuttered windows. Clara recognized the neighborhood. She'd walked these streets before, back when she'd been sent to run errands for the church. Marie stopped in front of a 3-story townhouse on Chartres Street. "This is the place. The merchant's house where the girl works." Clara looked up at the dark windows. "How do I get in?" "The kitchen door, around back. It's usually left unlocked for the servants." Marie handed her the lantern. "But Clara, listen to me. You have 5 minutes, maybe 10. If anyone sees you, they'll sound the alarm, and every constable in New Orleans will be hunting you by sunrise." "I understand." "Do you?" Marie grabbed her arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Because if you get caught, I can't save you again. No one can." Clara pulled her arm free. "I know what I'm doing." She didn't wait for Marie's response. She just turned and made her way down the narrow alley that ran alongside the house, her heart pounding in her chest. The kitchen door was exactly where Marie had said it would be. Clara tried the handle. Unlocked. She slipped inside and closed the door softly behind her. The kitchen was dark and smelled like yesterday's bread. Clara moved carefully, her bare feet silent on the stone floor. She could hear snoring from somewhere upstairs, the merchant and his family, sleeping soundly, unaware that a dead woman was walking through their house. She found the servants' quarters in the back, a small room with 3 narrow beds and a single candle burning low. 2 of the beds were empty. In the third, curled up under a thin blanket, was Lisette. Clara approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. She knelt beside the bed and gently touched the girl's shoulder. Lisette's eyes flew open. She started to scream, but Clara clamped a hand over her mouth. "Shh," Clara whispered. "It's me. It's Clara." Lisette's eyes went wide. She stared at Clara like she was seeing a ghost, which, in a way, she was. Clara slowly removed her hand. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just needed to see that you were all right." But you're dead," Lisette whispered. "They hanged you." "They tried to, but I'm still here," Clara smiled. "And I wanted to tell you something before I leave." "Leave? Where are you going?" "Away from here, somewhere they can't find me." Clara took Lisette's hand. "But I need you to do something for me. I need you to live. Do you understand? Live a real life, not the life they tell you to live, but the one you choose for yourself." Tears welled up in Lisette's eyes. "I don't know how. You'll learn. You're stronger than you think." Clara squeezed her hand. "And when things get hard, when people try to tell you who you are and what you're worth, I want you to remember something. Remember that there was a woman who loved you enough to kill for you. Remember that you're worth fighting for." Lisette nodded, tears streaming down her face. Clara stood up. "I have to go now, but I'll think of you. Always." She turned to leave, but Lisette grabbed her hand. "Clara?" "Yes?" "Thank you." Clara smiled. "You're welcome, child." She pulled free and walked back through the kitchen, through the door, back into the night where Marie was waiting. They left the quarter before sunrise, moving through the city like smoke. Marie led Clara to a small house near the river, hidden behind a grove of willows. Inside, an older man, a freed slave named Baptiste, was waiting with supplies: food, clean clothes, a pair of worn boots, and a map. "This will take you to Baton Rouge," Baptiste said, spreading the map on the table. "From there, you follow the river north to Natchez, then Memphis, then Cairo. In Cairo, there are people who can help you cross into free territory." Clara studied the map. The distances were vast, the journey impossibly long, but she'd already come back from the dead. Compared to that, walking 1,000 miles seemed almost easy. "Thank you," she said. Baptiste nodded. "Marie says you're brave. You'll need that where you're going." "I know." Marie handed her a small cloth bag. "Herbs for healing. And something else. Something to help you if the pain gets too bad." Clara looked at her. "What pain?" "The pain of remembering." Marie's eyes were sad. "It doesn't go away just because you run. You'll carry it with you everywhere you go. But maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe that pain will remind you why you had to do what you did. Clara took the bag and tucked it into her pocket. I won't forget. I know you won't. As dawn broke over New Orleans, Clara left the city. She walked north along the river road, the Mississippi churning brown and endless beside her. Behind her, the city was waking up, church bells ringing, markets opening, people beginning their day. Somewhere in that city, a gravedigger would find an empty coffin and raise the alarm. Somewhere, constables would begin searching for the woman who had cheated death. Somewhere, people would whisper about the slave who had killed a reverend and then vanished like smoke. But Clara didn't look back. She just kept walking, one foot in front of the other, towards something that might have been freedom, or might have been just another kind of prison. She didn't know yet. All she knew was that she was alive, and she was moving, and that was enough. For now, that was enough. 3 days after Clara's grave was found empty, the rumors started. They began in the markets first, whispered between vendors selling oysters and okra. Then they spread to the taverns, the parlors, the churches. By the end of the week, everyone in New Orleans had heard some version of the story. The slave woman who killed the reverend had risen from the dead. Some said she'd made a pact with the devil, trading her soul for another chance at life. Others claimed she'd been visited by African spirits who'd breathed life back into her corpse. The more superstitious swore they'd seen her walking the streets at night, her eyes glowing like coals, her hands still stained with blood. Auguste Delacroix, the constable, didn't believe in ghosts or devils or African spirits, but he believed in fugitive slaves, and he knew that an empty grave meant one of 3 things: grave robbers, resurrection men stealing bodies for medical schools, or someone who'd never been dead in the first place. He chose to believe the third option, which meant Clara was out there somewhere, alive and running, and he was going to find her. Delacroix stood in his office on Royal Street, studying the map pinned to his wall. Red marks indicated plantations where slaves had recently gone missing. Blue marks showed towns along the river where fugitives had been spotted. And there, in the center of it all, was New Orleans, the beating heart of Louisiana's slave economy, where the capture and return of runaways was as much a business as sugar or cotton. His deputy, a young man named Louis Marchand, knocked on the doorframe. "Sir, we've got something." Delacroix looked up. "What is it?" A woman, matching Clara's description, was seen near Baton Rouge 3 days ago. She was traveling alone, heading north on the river road. Delacroix's jaw tightened. Did they try to apprehend her? They didn't realize who she was until after she'd moved on, but the witness is certain it was her. Same height, same build, same scar on her left hand from where she burned it on church candles. Delacroix moved to the map and traced a line north from New Orleans to Baton Rouge. It was about 80 miles, a long distance to cover on foot, but possible for someone determined enough. "She's moving fast," he muttered. "Too fast. She must have help." "What do you want to do?" Delacroix pulled the map off the wall and rolled it up. "Get the horses ready. We're riding to Baton Rouge." "Now, sir?" "It's almost nightfall." "Now." Delacroix grabbed his coat. "If she's headed north, she's trying to reach free territory, and if she makes it past Natchez, we'll lose her for good." They rode out within the hour. Delacroix and 4 of his men, all armed with rifles and pistols. The road north was rough, cutting through swamps and pine forests where the air was thick with mosquitoes and the sound of frogs. They stopped only to rest the horses, pushing hard through the night. By the time they reached Baton Rouge, the sun was rising over the river, painting the water gold. Delacroix made inquiries. He talked to ferrymen and merchants, innkeepers and farmers. Most people were reluctant to talk. No one wanted to be seen helping a constable hunt down a fugitive slave, even one who'd committed murder. But eventually he found someone willing to cooperate. A plantation overseer named Hugh Garrett, who'd been drinking away his wages in a riverside tavern. "Yeah, I seen her," Garrett slurred, his breath reeking of whiskey. "Couple days back. She was walking north on the river road, trying to look inconspicuous. But I know a runaway when I see one. Did you speak to her? Nah, didn't want no trouble. But I'll tell you this. She looked scared, like something was chasing her. Something was. Delacroix tossed a few coins on the table. If you see her again, send word. There's a reward. Garrett's eyes lit up. How much? Enough. Delacroix left the tavern and gathered his men. She's still ahead of us, but not by much. We'll split up. Marchand, you take the river road. The rest of you fan out and check the settlements. Anyone sees a black woman traveling alone, you bring her in. Understood? The men nodded and dispersed. Delacroix mounted his horse and rode north, his eyes scanning the road ahead. The river churned beside him, brown and endless, carrying barges loaded with cotton and sugar downstream toward New Orleans. Somewhere on this same road, Clara was walking, running, trying to escape. But escape to where? The north was still hundreds of miles away, and between here and there lay 1,000 dangers, slave catchers, patrols, bounty hunters, ordinary citizens who would turn her in for the reward. Even if she managed to avoid all of them, she'd still have to cross state lines, find the Underground Railroad, trust strangers not to betray her. The odds were against her. But Delacroix had learned over the years that desperate people could do impossible things. He just had to make sure she didn't succeed. Clara knew they were following her. She'd known since Baton Rouge, when she'd spotted the constable's men asking questions at the ferry landing. She'd kept her head down, stayed out of sight, and moved on before they could spot her. But she could feel them behind her now, like a shadow she couldn't shake. She'd been walking for 6 days, covering 20 miles a day when she could, less when the terrain got rough. Her feet were blistered and bleeding, her body ached from sleeping on the ground, and her stomach was a constant knot of hunger. The food Baptiste had given her was long gone, and she'd been surviving on whatever she could find, wild berries, roots, the occasional fish she managed to catch in shallow creeks. But she kept moving. North, always north. The landscape changed as she traveled. The swamps and bayous of New Orleans gave way to rolling hills and pine forests. The air grew slightly cooler, though the humidity never left. She passed plantations where she could hear the songs of field workers drifting across the cotton rows, and she had to resist the urge to stop, to warn them, to tell them what she'd done. But she couldn't save everyone. She could barely save herself. On the 7th day, Clara reached a small settlement called Port Hudson. It was barely more than a cluster of buildings around a bend in the river, a general store, a blacksmith, a church with a sagging roof, and a handful of houses. She approached carefully, staying in the tree line, watching for signs of constables or slave catchers. The settlement looked quiet, too quiet. Clara waited until dusk, then slipped into the town under cover of darkness. She needed supplies, food, water, maybe a warmer blanket for the cold nights ahead. She found the general store locked, but the back window was loose. She pried it open and climbed inside. The store smelled like tobacco and leather. Clara moved quickly through the darkness, grabbing what she could: dried beef, hardtack, a canteen, a wool blanket. She also found a man's coat hanging on a peg, too large for her, but it would keep her warm. She put it on and was about to leave when she heard voices outside. "Saw her come this way, I'm telling you." Clara froze. "You sure it was her?" "Could have been any colored woman. Had the same coat, same walk. It's her." Clara's heart hammered in her chest. She looked around frantically for another exit, but there was only the front door and the window she'd come through. The voices were getting closer. She made a decision. Clara grabbed a lantern from the shelf, lit it with a match, and hurled it against the far wall. The glass shattered, oil splashing across the wooden floor. Flames erupted immediately, hungry and bright. Then she ran. She dove through the window just as the front door burst open. Behind her, she heard shouting, men's voices, angry and confused, but she didn't look back. She just ran into the darkness, her lungs burning, her legs pumping. The settlement erupted into chaos. Bells rang, people shouted. She could hear the constable's men organizing, spreading out to search the perimeter. Clara veered off the main road and plunged into the forest. Branches tore at her face and arms. Roots threatened to trip her, but she didn't slow down. She ran until her legs gave out, until she collapsed against a fallen log, gasping for air. She'd bought herself time, but not much. They knew she was here now. They knew she was close, and they weren't going to stop hunting her. Delacroix arrived in Port Hudson an hour after the fire started. Half the general store had burned before the townspeople managed to put it out, and the owner, a portly man named Henderson, was furious. "She destroyed my store," Henderson shouted, gesturing at the charred remains. "Everything I own was in there." "We'll catch her," Delacroix said calmly. "How long ago did she run?" "Maybe an hour. She went into the woods, heading north." Delacroix turned to his men. "Get torches. We're going after her." Marchand looked uncertain. "Sir, it's dark. The forest is dense. She could be anywhere." "Then we search everywhere." Delacroix's voice was hard. "I'm not letting her slip away again." They rode into the forest with torches blazing, the light casting long, dancing shadows through the trees. Delacroix had brought tracking dogs, bloodhounds from a plantation near Baton Rouge, and they picked up Clara's scent almost immediately, baying and straining at their leashes. The hunt was on. Clara heard the dogs before she saw the torches. The sound of their howling sent ice through her veins. She'd heard stories about what happened to runaways caught by dogs, the torn flesh, the broken bones, the screaming. She forced herself to her feet and kept moving, even though every muscle in her body begged her to stop. She waded through a creek, hoping the water would mask her scent. It didn't work. The dogs kept coming, their baying growing louder. She climbed a steep hillside, her hands scrabbling at roots and rocks. Behind her, she could see the torchlight flickering through the trees, getting closer. She could hear men's voices shouting to each other. At the top of the hill, Clara found herself at the edge of a ravine. The drop was steep, maybe 30 feet down to a rocky stream bed below. In the darkness, she couldn't tell how deep the water was or what lay at the bottom. The dogs were almost upon her now. She could hear them crashing through the underbrush, could smell their hot breath. Clara looked at the ravine, then she looked back at the torches, and she jumped. The fall seemed to last forever. Wind rushed past her face, and for a moment she felt weightless, suspended between earth and sky. Then she hit the water with a bone-jarring impact that knocked the air from her lungs. The stream was shallow, maybe 4 feet deep. She'd landed on her side, and pain exploded through her ribs. But she was alive. She dragged herself out of the water and stumbled downstream, her vision blurring. Behind her, she heard the dogs reach the edge of the ravine, barking furiously. She heard men's voices debating whether to climb down. "It's too steep," someone said. "We'll break our necks." "Then we go round. There's a path 1/2 mile back." Clara didn't wait to hear more. She kept moving, following the stream as it wound through the ravine. Her ribs screamed with every breath, and she was pretty sure at least one was broken. But she couldn't stop. Not yet. She walked through the night, using the stream as her guide. The ravine eventually opened up into a wider valley, and the trees thinned out. By the time the sun rose, she'd put several miles between herself and her pursuers, but they were still out there, still hunting. And Clara was running out of places to run. On the 9th day, Clara reached Natchez. It was a river town, bigger than Port Hudson, but smaller than New Orleans, perched on high bluffs overlooking the Mississippi. The town was divided into 2 parts. Natchez under the hill, the rough waterfront district full of gamblers and prostitutes and riverboat men, and Natchez proper, where the respectable citizens lived in grand mansions surrounded by gardens. Clara knew she couldn't stay. Natchez was a major hub for the slave trade, with auction houses and holding pens scattered throughout the town. But she needed to cross the river, and the ferry landing was here. She waited until nightfall, then made her way down to the waterfront. The docks were crowded with steamboats and flatboats, their decks piled high with cotton bales and cargo. Dock workers, most of them enslaved men, moved through the chaos, loading and unloading goods under the watchful eyes of overseers. Clara kept to the shadows, watching for an opportunity. She found it when a small flatboat began casting off, heading upriver toward Memphis. The crew consisted of 3 men, and they were too busy with the ropes and poles to notice when Clara slipped aboard and hid herself among the cargo. The boat pushed away from the dock, and Clara felt the gentle rocking as they entered the current. She was so exhausted that she fell asleep almost immediately, curled up between crates of tools and barrels of salt pork. She woke to voices. "Telling you, I saw someone climb aboard. You're seeing things. Too much whiskey. Check anyway. If there's a stowaway, the captain'll want to know." Clara's eyes snapped open. Daylight was streaming through gaps in the cargo. She could hear footsteps on the deck above her, coming closer. She looked around frantically. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to go. If they found her, they'd turn her over to the authorities in the next town, and she'd be back in chains before nightfall. The footsteps stopped right above her hiding spot. Clara held her breath. A shadow fell across her face as someone moved a crate. She tensed, ready to fight if she had to. Then a hand reached down, not to grab her, but to offer help. Clara looked up and saw a man staring down at her. He was young, maybe 30, with dark skin and intelligent eyes. He put a finger to his lips, signaling for silence. Then he moved the crate back, hiding her from view. "Nothing here," he called out to the others. "Just cargo." "You sure?" "I'm sure. Come on, we've got work to do." The footsteps moved away. Clara waited, her heart pounding. After a few minutes, the man returned. He crouched down beside her hiding spot and spoke in a low voice. "You're running." It wasn't a question. Clara nodded. "How far are you planning to go?" "As far as I can." The man studied her for a moment. "You're Clara, aren't you? The woman from New Orleans, the one who killed the Reverend." Clara's blood ran cold. "How do you know that?" "Word travels on the river. They're looking for you. Constables, slave catchers, bounty hunters. There's a reward on your head, $500. $500. It was a fortune, enough to set a man up for life. Clara waited for him to call out, to alert the others, to claim his reward. Instead, he said, "My name is Isaiah, and I'm going to help you." Isaiah was a free man, one of the few black rivermen who owned his own boat. He'd been born into slavery in Virginia, but his master had freed him in his will, a rare act of conscience that Isaiah never took for granted. He'd spent the last 10 years working the Mississippi, transporting cargo, and occasionally transporting something more valuable, runaway slaves heading north. "You're part of the Underground Railroad?" Clara asked. "Not officially, but I help when I can." Isaiah handed her a piece of salt pork and some hardtack. "Eat. You look half dead." Clara ate ravenously, barely tasting the food. "Why are you helping me?" "Because what you did needed doing. Everyone on the river knows what kind of man Whitaker was. He wasn't the only one either. There's men like him all up and down this river, hiding behind their Bibles and their pulpits." Isaiah paused. "Someone had to stop him. I'm glad it was you." Clara felt something in her chest loosen, just a little. For days she'd been running and hiding, convinced that everyone she met would turn her in. But here was someone who understood, someone who saw her not as a fugitive or a murderer, but as a person who'd made an impossible choice. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Don't thank me yet. You're not safe." Isaiah glanced toward the deck. "We're heading upriver to Memphis. From there I can connect you with people who can take you further north, Cairo, then across into Illinois. But Clara, you need to understand something. The closer you get to free territory, the more dangerous it becomes. The slave catchers know the routes. They watch the crossings. One wrong move, and they'll have you." "I understand." "Do you?" Isaiah's gaze was intense. "Because if you get caught, they won't just hang you. They'll make an example of you. They'll want every slave in the South to see what happens when you kill a white man." Clara met his eyes. "I've already died once. I'm not afraid anymore." Isaiah studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right, but you do exactly what I tell you when I tell you." "Agreed." "Agreed." For the next 3 days, Clara stayed hidden in the cargo hold while Isaiah's boat made its way up the Mississippi. They passed plantations and small settlements, steamboats and trading posts. Sometimes Clara heard voices, men shouting questions to Isaiah about whether he'd seen a fugitive slave, a woman matching her description. Isaiah always said no. At night, when the boat was anchored and the crew was asleep, Isaiah would bring Clara up on deck for fresh air. She'd stand at the railing, looking out at the river, watching the moonlight dance on the water. "You ever think about going back?" Isaiah asked one night. Clara shook her head. "There's nothing to go back to." "What about the girl, Lisette?" Clara's chest tightened. She thought about the last time she'd seen Lisette, tears streaming down her face, thanking her. "She'll be all right. She's stronger than she knows. And you? Will you be all right?" Clara didn't answer right away. She thought about everything she'd lost, her home, her name, her life. She thought about the nights in Whitaker's study, the weight of the knife in her hand, the look in his eyes when he realized what was about to happen. "I don't know," she said finally. "But at least now I have a chance to find out." Isaiah nodded. "That's more than most people get." On the 4th day, they reached Memphis. Memphis was chaos. The docks were packed with steamboats and flatboats, cargo being loaded and unloaded in a constant frenzy of activity. The air smelled like coal smoke and river water, and the sharp tang of whiskey from the saloons that lined the waterfront. Everywhere Clara looked, she saw people, rivermen and merchants, slave traders and freedmen, all moving through the streets with purpose. Isaiah docked the boat and helped Clara off. "Stay close to me. Don't make eye contact with anyone. And for God's sake, don't run. Running makes you look guilty." They made their way through the crowd, Isaiah leading her away from the docks and into the city proper. Memphis was bigger than Clara had expected. Wider streets, taller buildings, more people. But it was still a southern city, still a place where slavery was legal and runaways were hunted. Isaiah led her to a small house on the edge of town, tucked away behind a livery stable. He knocked 3 times, paused, then knocked twice more. The door opened a crack. A woman's face appeared, older with grey hair and sharp eyes. "Isaiah," she said. "It's been a while. I brought someone who needs help." The woman looked at Clara, her gaze assessing. Then she opened the door wider. "Come in, quickly." Inside, the house was small but clean. A fire burned in the hearth, and the smell of cornbread filled the air. The woman gestured for Clara to sit. "My name is Ruth," she said. "Isaiah tells me you're heading north." Clara nodded. "Do you know how far Cairo is from here?" "No. 300 miles, give or take." Ruth poured Clara a cup of water. "It'll take you 2 weeks on foot, maybe longer. And every mile of that journey is dangerous. You'll be crossing through some of the worst country for runaways. Slave catchers know the routes, they watch the roads. If you're going to make it, you'll need help." "I know." Ruth sat down across from her. "There's a network of safe houses between here and Cairo, people who'll hide you, feed you, point you in the right direction. But you have to be careful. Not everyone who claims to help is trustworthy. There are people who pretend to be part of the railroad just to collect bounties." Clara's stomach tightened. "How do I know who to trust?" "You don't. Not always." Ruth reached into her pocket and pulled out a small piece of cloth, a white handkerchief with a blue cross stitched in one corner. "But if someone shows you this symbol, they're safe. It's how we identify each other." Clara took the handkerchief, studying the stitching. It was simple, almost crude, but it felt like a lifeline. "Thank you," she said. Ruth stood up. "You'll leave tonight. There's a wagon heading north to a settlement called Randolph. It's about halfway to Cairo. The driver is one of ours. He'll get you there safely. And after that? After that, someone else will take you the next leg. That's how it works. One safe house to the next, all the way to the border. Ruth paused. But Clara, I need you to understand something. Even if you make it to Illinois, you won't be completely safe. The Fugitive Slave Act means you can still be captured and dragged back south. The only place you'll truly be free is Canada. Canada. The word felt impossibly far away. One step at a time, Clara said quietly. Ruth nodded. One step at a time. That night, Clara climbed into the back of a covered wagon driven by a man named Ezekiel, a free black farmer who made runs between Memphis and Randolph under the pretense of delivering produce. Clara hid beneath a pile of burlap sacks, trying to ignore the smell of onions and potatoes. As the wagon rolled through the darkness, Clara thought about how far she'd come, from New Orleans to Baton Rouge, Port Hudson to Natchez, and now Memphis. Each mile had been a battle, each day a test of survival, but she was still here, still moving, still free. And she wasn't going to stop until she reached the end. The journey from Memphis to Cairo took 18 days. 18 days of hiding in barns and cellars, of traveling only at night, of trusting strangers who showed her a blue cross stitched on white cloth. 18 days of hunger and exhaustion, of jumping at every sound, of wondering if the next house would be a safe haven or a trap. But Clara kept moving. She traveled through Tennessee and into southern Illinois, following a network of safe houses that stretched like a chain across the landscape. Each conductor on the railroad was different. Some were Quakers, moved by religious conviction. Others were free black people who remembered their own years in bondage. A few were even white Southerners who'd turned against the institution of slavery after witnessing its horrors firsthand. They all risked everything to help her. In Randolph, she stayed 3 days in the cellar of a Baptist minister's house while slave catchers searched the town. In Jonesboro, a German immigrant farmer hid her in his hay wagon and drove her 30 miles north, singing Lutheran hymns the whole way. In Carbondale, she met a woman named Harriet, not Tubman, but another conductor who'd made the journey north herself and now helped others do the same. How much further? Clara asked. Cairo's 2 days from here, Harriet said. But that's where it gets dangerous. Cairo's right on the border between Illinois and Kentucky, between free territory and slave territory. The slave catchers know that everyone trying to cross goes through Cairo. They watch that town like hawks. Clara's heart sank. She'd come so far, only to face another obstacle. How do I get across? There's a man who runs a ferry across the Ohio River. His name is Thomas Garrett. No relation to the Philadelphia Garrett, but just as committed to the cause. He'll get you to the other side, into Ohio. From there, you can make your way to Cleveland, then across Lake Erie to Canada. Canada? The word still felt like a dream. When can I go? Tomorrow night. But Clara... Harriet's expression grew serious. You need to know that Delacroix is in Cairo. Clara went cold. The constable from New Orleans? The same. He's been tracking you for weeks. He knows you're heading for Cairo, and he's waiting there with 6 men. Harriet paused. He's obsessed. People say he's spent his own money on the hunt, that he won't give up until you're caught. Clara thought about the constable, his cold eyes, his methodical manner, the way he'd shackled her wrists in the chapel. She'd known he wouldn't give up easily, but she hadn't expected him to follow her this far. Then I'll have to be careful, she said. Careful might not be enough. Harriet pulled out a pistol and set it on the table between them. Take this. Clara stared at the gun. I don't know how to shoot. Then learn. Because if Delacroix corners you, he won't give you a choice. Harriet pushed the pistol toward her. I'm not saying you should kill him. I'm saying you should be able to protect yourself. Clara picked up the gun. It was heavier than she'd expected, the metal cold against her palm. She thought about Whitaker, about the knife, about the moment when everything had changed. Could she do it again? Could she kill another man? She didn't know. But she took the pistol anyway. Clara arrived in Cairo on a moonless night, hidden in the back of a coal wagon. The town sat at the confluence of the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, a strategic location that made it both prosperous and dangerous. The air smelled like river water and coal smoke, and even at this late hour she could hear the sounds of the docks, men shouting, boats whistling, cargo being loaded. The wagon driver, a young Quaker man named Samuel, helped her out behind a warehouse. "Thomas Garrett's ferry is on the east side of town," Samuel whispered, "but there are patrols everywhere. You'll need to be quick and quiet." Clara nodded, adjusting the pistol tucked into her waistband. Samuel handed her a worn coat. "Wear this. It's cold on the river. Thank you. Go with God, Clara. And if you make it to Canada, remember us. Remember the people who helped you." "I will." She slipped into the darkness, moving through the narrow streets of Cairo like a ghost. The town was laid out in a grid, making it easier to navigate but also more exposed. She kept to the alleys and side streets, avoiding the main roads where lanterns burned and night watchmen patrolled. She was 3 blocks from the river when she saw them, 4 men on horseback moving slowly through the street ahead. Even in the darkness, she recognized the lead rider, Auguste Delacroix, sitting tall in the saddle, his eyes scanning the shadows. Clara pressed herself against the wall of a building, barely breathing. "Can't have gone far," one of the men was saying. "We've got men at every crossing." "She's here," Delacroix said. His voice was calm, certain. "I can feel it." They rode past, so close that Clara could have reached out and touched Delacroix's boot. She waited until they'd turned the corner, then ran in the opposite direction. She reached the riverfront and found Thomas Garrett's ferry, a small, flat-bottomed boat tied to a rickety dock. A man stood beside it, smoking a pipe. He was in his 60s, with white hair and a weathered face. "Mr. Garrett," Clara whispered. He turned, studying her. "You Clara?" "Yes." "You're late." "I was starting to think you weren't coming." He knocked the ash from his pipe. "Get in the boat. We need to leave now." Clara climbed into the boat, her heart pounding. Garrett untied the ropes and pushed off from the dock, using a long pole to guide them into the current. The Ohio River was wide and dark, its surface rippling with reflected starlight. On the far shore, Clara could see the lights of a small town, Wycliffe, Kentucky. But they weren't heading to Kentucky. They were heading east, parallel to the shore, toward a landing on the Ohio side. Garrett worked in silence, his movements practiced and efficient. Clara sat in the bottom of the boat, watching the shoreline slide past. They were halfway across when she heard it, the sound of horses coming from the dock they'd just left. "There, on the river!" Clara's blood froze. Garrett cursed under his breath and started rowing faster. "Get down! Stay low!" Clara flattened herself in the boat. Behind them she heard shouting, then the sharp crack of a gunshot. The bullet hit the water 20 feet behind them, sending up a small splash. "They're shooting," Clara said. "They won't hit us. Too dark, too far." But Garrett's jaw was tight. "Just stay down." More shots rang out. One bullet whistled past, close enough that Clara felt the air move. Another struck the side of the boat with a solid thunk, punching through the wood. Water began seeping in. "We're taking on water," Garrett said. "We need to move faster." He rowed with everything he had, his arms straining. Clara grabbed a bucket and started bailing, scooping water and tossing it overboard as fast as she could. Behind them, she heard horses entering the water, splashing through the shallows. Delacroix and his men were coming after them. "Faster!" Clara shouted. "I'm going as fast as I can." The Ohio shore was getting closer, 100 yards, then 50, then 20. But the boat was sinking, the water rising above Clara's ankles. Garrett stood up, using the pole to push them the last few yards. The boat scraped against the rocky shore, and Clara jumped out, stumbling in the shallow water. "Go!" Garrett shouted. "The safe house is a mile north, a white farmhouse with a red door. Tell them Thomas sent you." Clara ran. Behind her, she heard horses crashing through the water, heard Delacroix's voice shouting orders. She didn't look back. She just ran into the darkness, her lungs burning, her legs pumping. She'd made it to Ohio, free territory. But she wasn't free yet. The farmhouse appeared like a miracle. White clapboard siding, a red door, smoke rising from the chimney. Clara pounded on the door, gasping for breath. "Please," she managed. "Thomas sent me." The door opened. A woman stood there, middle-aged with kind eyes. "Quickly," she said, pulling Clara inside. "They're right behind you." She led Clara through the house and down into the cellar, where a hidden door was built into the wall. Behind it was a small room, barely big enough for a person to sit in. "Get in," the woman said. "Don't make a sound." Clara crawled into the hiding space. The woman closed the door, and Clara heard something heavy being moved in front of it. Furniture or a barrel, something to hide the entrance. Then she waited. Minutes later, she heard pounding on the front door, heard men's voices demanding entry, heard Delacroix questioning the woman. "Have you seen a colored woman? She came this way." "No, sir. I've been alone all evening. You mind if we search the house?" "I do mind, actually. This is my property, and you have no authority here. This is Ohio, not Louisiana." A pause. Then Delacroix's voice, cold and measured. "I have a warrant. Step aside." Clara heard boots on the floorboards above, heavy footsteps moving through the house. They searched the kitchen, the bedrooms, the parlor. Then they came down to the cellar. Clara held her breath, her hand on the pistol. The footsteps moved around the cellar, stopping and starting. Someone kicked at the walls, testing for hollow spaces. "Anything?" Delacroix called down. "Nothing, sir. Just storage." "Check again." More footsteps, more kicking. Clara's heart hammered so loud she was sure they could hear it. Then finally, "She's not here, sir. She has to be. We saw her come this way. Maybe she kept running, could be in the woods by now." A long silence. Clara imagined Delacroix standing in the cellar, his cold eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. Finally, "All right, but we'll be watching this house. If she shows up, you'll answer for it." The footsteps retreated. The front door slammed. Clara stayed hidden for another hour, not daring to move. When the woman finally opened the hiding space, Clara was shaking. "They're gone," the woman said. "But they'll be back. You need to leave as soon as it's safe." "Where do I go?" "North. There's a town called Ripley, about 60 miles from here. Cross the river there, and you'll be deeper into Ohio, further from the slave catchers." The woman helped Clara out of the hiding space. "But you should rest first. You look exhausted." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to keep moving, but her body was at its limit. She nodded and let the woman lead her to a small bedroom upstairs. She slept for 12 hours straight. When Clara woke, the sun was high and the house was quiet. The woman, her name was Margaret, brought her food and fresh clothes. "Delacroix's men are still in town," Margaret said, "but they're searching the wrong areas. If you leave tonight, you should be able to slip past them." "Why are you doing this?" Clara asked. "You could hang for helping me." Margaret smiled sadly. "My sister was a slave once, down in Virginia. She died trying to escape, drowned in a river. I couldn't save her, but maybe I can save you." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You still have a long way to go." That night, Margaret's husband drove Clara north in a wagon loaded with hay. They traveled back roads and logging trails, avoiding the main routes where patrols would be watching. It took 3 days to reach Ripley. The town sat on the banks of the Ohio River, directly across from Kentucky. Margaret's husband left Clara with a free black family who lived on the edge of town. "You'll cross tomorrow," the father told her. "There's a woman on the Kentucky side, a white woman named Mrs. Rankin, who helps people like you. She'll hide you until it's safe to keep moving north." Clara stared across the river. So close. She was so close. But she had to go back into slave territory to continue her journey. The irony wasn't lost on her. "What if I get caught? Then you get caught. But if you don't try, you'll never know." The man put a hand on her shoulder. "You've come this far. Don't give up now," Clara nodded. The next night she crossed the Ohio River one more time, rowing a small boat under cover of darkness. She reached the Kentucky shore and found Mrs. Rankin's house, a large home on a hill overlooking the river, with a lantern burning in the window as a signal. Mrs. Rankin was a small, fierce woman with grey hair and sharp eyes. "You must be Clara," she said. "Come in, quickly." She hid Clara in an attic room and brought her food and water. "How long do I have to stay here?" Clara asked. "A few days, maybe a week. Delacroix has men watching the river crossings. We need to wait until things calm down." Mrs. Rankin sat down on the edge of the bed. "But I want you to know something. You're going to make it. I've helped dozens of people cross, and I can tell when someone has the strength to see it through. You do." Clara wanted to believe her. But she'd been running for so long, had come so close to capture so many times, that hope felt dangerous. "What if Delacroix finds me? Then I'll deal with him." Mrs. Rankin's eyes were hard. "I'm a white woman with money and connections. He can't touch me the way he can touch you. And if he tries to search my house, I'll make sure he regrets it." Clara spent 6 days in Mrs. Rankin's attic. During that time, she learned that Delacroix hadn't given up. He was still in the area, still searching, still convinced that Clara was close. On the 7th day, Mrs. Rankin came to her with news. "There's a wagon train leaving for Cleveland tomorrow morning. Traders and families all heading north. I've arranged for you to hide in one of the wagons. It'll take about 2 weeks to reach Cleveland, but once you're there, you'll be safe. The city has a large free black community, and they'll help you get to Canada." Clara felt something loosen in her chest. "Canada, Canada," Mrs. Rankin confirmed. "Freedom, real freedom." The next morning, Clara climbed into the back of a merchant's wagon, hidden beneath crates of tools and bolts of fabric. As the wagon train rolled north, she closed her eyes and let herself imagine it, a place where no one could claim to own her, where she could walk down the street without fear, where her life would be her own. She'd killed a man to get here. She'd died and come back. She'd crossed rivers and forests, outrun dogs and bullets, trusted strangers with her life, and soon, it would all be worth it. But freedom, Clara would learn, was never simple. The wagon train made it as far as Columbus before disaster struck. They were camped for the night, and Clara was sleeping in the wagon when she heard shouting. She woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of horses, slave catchers. They'd found the wagon train somehow. Maybe someone had talked. Maybe Delacroix had followed them. Clara didn't know and didn't have time to figure it out. She grabbed the pistol and ran. Behind her, men were searching the wagons, pulling people out, demanding to see papers. Clara ran into the woods, branches tearing at her face. She heard horses coming after her, heard dogs baying in the distance. Not again, not after everything. She ran until her lungs burned, until her legs gave out. She collapsed against a tree, gasping for air. And that's when she saw him, Auguste Delacroix, sitting on his horse not 20 feet away. He didn't move. He just watched her, his face expressionless. "Hello, Clara." But freedom, Clara would learn, was never simple. The wagon train made it as far as Columbus before disaster struck. They were camped for the night, and Clara was sleeping in the wagon when she heard shouting. She woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of horses, slave catchers. They'd found the wagon train somehow. Maybe someone had talked. Maybe Delacroix had followed them. Clara didn't know and didn't have time to figure it out. She grabbed the pistol and ran. Behind her, men were searching the wagons, pulling people out, demanding to see papers. Clara ran into the woods, branches tearing at her face. She heard horses coming after her, heard dogs baying in the distance. Not again, not after everything. She ran until her lungs burned, until her legs gave out. She collapsed against a tree, gasping for air. And that's when she saw him, Auguste Delacroix, sitting on his horse not 20 feet away. He didn't move. He just watched her, his face expressionless. "Hello, Clara." But freedom, Clara would learn, was never simple. The wagon train made it as far as Columbus before disaster struck. They were camped for the night, and Clara was sleeping in the wagon when she heard shouting. She woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of horses, slave catchers. They'd found the wagon train somehow. Maybe someone had talked. Maybe Delacroix had followed them. Clara didn't know and didn't have time to figure it out. She grabbed the pistol and ran. Behind her, men were searching the wagons, pulling people out, demanding to see papers. Clara ran into the woods, branches tearing at her face. She heard horses coming after her, heard dogs baying in the distance. Not again, not after everything. She ran until her lungs burned, until her legs gave out. She collapsed against a tree, gasping for air, and that's when she saw him, Auguste Delacroix, sitting on his horse not 20 feet away. He didn't move. He just watched her, his face expressionless. "Hello, Clara." But freedom, Clara would learn, was never simple. The wagon train made it as far as Columbus before disaster struck. They were camped for the night, and Clara was sleeping in the wagon when she heard shouting. She woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of horses, slave catchers. They'd found the wagon train somehow. Maybe someone had talked. Maybe Delacroix had followed them. Clara didn't know and didn't have time to figure it out. She grabbed the pistol and ran. Behind her, men were searching the wagons, pulling people out, demanding to see papers. Clara ran into the woods, branches tearing at her face. She heard horses coming after her, heard dogs baying in the distance. Not again, not after everything. She ran until her lungs burned, until her legs gave out. She collapsed against a tree, gasping for air, and that's when she saw him, Auguste Delacroix, sitting on his horse not 20 feet away. He didn't move. He just watched her, his face expressionless. "Hello, Clara," he said quietly. Clara's hand went to the pistol at her waist. "Don't," Delacroix said. "You won't make it. My men are all around us." Clara looked around. He was right. She could see shadows moving through the trees, at least 5 men, maybe more, all closing in slowly, like wolves circling prey. She was trapped. Delacroix dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked toward her, his boots crunching on fallen leaves. When he was 10 feet away, he stopped. "You've led me on quite a chase," he said. 300 miles, nearly 2 months. I've spent a small fortune tracking you down." Clara's hand tightened on the pistol grip. "Then you wasted your money, perhaps." Delacroix tilted his head, studying her. "Do you know what I've learned about you, Clara? What people say about you?" She didn't answer. "They say you're a ghost, a demon. They say you made a deal with the devil to escape your grave." He paused. "They say that when the Reverend Whitaker died, the church bells rang backward." "They're wrong," Clara said. "I'm not a demon. I'm just a woman who had enough. A woman who murdered a man of God. Man of God who raped women and girls. A man of God who used his power to destroy lives." Clara's voice was steady now, all the fear burned away by anger. "You know what he was. Everyone knew. But nobody did anything about it because he was white and we were property." Delacroix's jaw tightened. "The law is the law. Then the law is a lie." For a moment something flickered in Delacroix's eyes. Doubt, maybe, or recognition. But it passed quickly, replaced by that cold, methodical resolve. "Give me the gun," he said, extending his hand. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Clara looked at the pistol in her hand. She thought about Whitaker's study, about Lisette's tears, about the knife. She thought about the grave, the river, the endless miles of running. She thought about Canada, still so far away. Then she looked at Delacroix and made her choice. No. She raised the pistol. Delacroix moved faster than she expected, diving to the side just as she pulled the trigger. The shot went wide, the crack of gunfire echoing through the forest. Then chaos erupted. Delacroix's men rushed in from all sides. Clara fired again, aiming at the nearest shadow. Someone screamed. She ran, zigzagging through the trees, branches whipping her face. More gunshots behind her. A bullet splintered a tree trunk next to her head. Another grazed her shoulder, sending a line of fire across her skin. But she kept running. She burst out of the forest into a clearing and found herself at the edge of a cliff. Below, a river churned white over rocks, maybe 40 feet down. Behind her, she heard Delacroix shouting orders, heard horses crashing through the underbrush. Clara stood at the edge, looking down at the water. She'd jumped off a cliff before, in the ravine near Port Hudson. She'd survived that fall, but this one was higher, the water more violent. If she jumped, she might die, probably would die. But if she didn't jump, Delacroix would take her back to Louisiana, back to the noose. Clara took a breath. She thought about her mother, who she'd never known. She thought about all the women who'd suffered in silence, who'd died without ever tasting freedom. She thought about Lisette and the life the girl might have now that Whitaker was gone. And she thought about what Marie had told her in that jail cell. You can die on the gallows and become a martyr, or you can live and become something else. Clara had already become a martyr. Now she wanted to live. She jumped. The fall seemed to last forever. Wind roared in her ears, and for a moment she was weightless, flying free. Then she hit the water with an impact that felt like hitting stone. The river swallowed her, pulling her down into darkness. The current was vicious, tumbling her over and over, slamming her against rocks. She couldn't tell which way was up. Her lungs screamed for air. But she fought. She clawed her way toward what she hoped was the surface, kicking with legs that felt like lead. Her hand broke through first, then her head, and she gasped in a lungful of precious air. The river swept her downstream, fast and merciless. She struggled to keep her head above water, to avoid the rocks that rose up like teeth. Behind her, she could hear shouting from the cliff, Delacroix's men, but they sounded distant now, fading. The river carried her for what felt like miles. By the time she managed to drag herself onto the bank, she was miles from the cliff, miles from Delacroix. She lay in the mud, coughing up river water, her whole body shaking. But she was alive. Clara spent the next 3 days in a fever, delirious and half dead in a hollow beneath a fallen tree. The bullet wound in her shoulder had become infected, and her body was fighting a war against itself. She dreamed of New Orleans, of the chapel, the blood, the singing. She dreamed of Whitaker's face, of his cold hands, of the moment when the knife had found its mark. She dreamed of the grave, of dirt falling on the coffin, of suffocating in darkness. And she dreamed of freedom, a place where the sun was warm and the air was sweet, and no one could ever hurt her again. On the 4th day, she woke to find an old woman kneeling beside her. "Easy," the woman said. "You've been real sick." Clara tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. The woman held a cup to her lips. "Drink." Clara drank. The water was cool and clean, the best thing she'd ever tasted. "Where am I?" she managed. "About 40 miles north of Columbus. My husband found you when he was checking his traps. You're lucky. Another day, and you'd have been dead." Clara closed her eyes. Lucky. She'd been called many things, but never lucky. "The men who were chasing me, long gone. They think you drowned. Found your shawl downstream. Figured the river got you." The woman smiled. "They stopped looking." Clara felt something break open in her chest, relief so profound it was almost painful. "What's your name?" the woman asked. Clara opened her mouth to answer, then stopped. Clara was the name of a slave, the name of a woman who'd killed a reverend and died in a grave and been hunted across 3 states. Maybe it was time for a new name. "Grace," she said. "My name is Grace." The woman nodded. "Well, Grace, you're welcome to stay here as long as you need. My husband and I don't ask questions. We just help folks when they need helping." "Thank you." "Thank the Lord. He's the one who led my husband to find you." Clara, Grace, didn't correct her. If the woman wanted to thank God, that was fine. But Grace knew the truth. She'd survived on her own strength, her own will, her own refusal to give up. She'd saved herself. It took 2 weeks for Grace to recover enough to travel. When she was strong enough, the old couple gave her supplies and directions to Cleveland. From there, you can catch a ship across Lake Erie to Canada, the old man said. Port of Cleveland has boats leaving every day. Just keep your head down and don't talk to strangers. Grace nodded. She'd gotten good at keeping her head down. She walked the final 100 miles to Cleveland over the course of 10 days. The landscape changed as she traveled, flatter, more open, with farms and small towns dotting the countryside. She passed fewer plantations and more free settlements, places where black people lived and worked without chains. It gave her hope. Cleveland appeared on the horizon like a promise, a sprawling city on the shores of Lake Erie, with smokestacks and church spires reaching toward the sky. Grace entered the city on a grey October morning, the air sharp with the promise of winter. She made her way to the docks and found a shipping office. "I need passage to Canada," she told the clerk. He looked her up and down. "You got money?" Grace pulled out the few coins she'd earned doing laundry in the towns she'd passed through. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. The clerk counted it and nodded. "There's a steamer leaving tomorrow morning for Port Stanley. That'll get you across. From there, you're on your own. That's all I need." She spent that night in a boarding house for colored travelers, in a narrow room with a single bed and a window that looked out over the lake. She sat by the window for hours, watching the water, thinking about everything that had brought her here. She thought about Whitaker and whether his death had been worth it. She thought about Lisette and hoped the girl was safe. She thought about Marie and Isaiah and Ruth and all the others who'd helped her, who'd risked everything so she could have this chance. And she thought about Clara, the woman she'd been in New Orleans, the woman who'd scrubbed floors and endured horrors and finally said enough. That woman was gone now. In her place was Grace, someone new, someone forged in violence and survival and hope. The next morning, Grace boarded the steamer. She stood at the railing as the ship pulled away from the dock, watching Cleveland recede into the distance. The lake stretched out before her, grey and endless, separating one world from another. The crossing took 6 hours. When the Canadian shore came into view, Grace felt something she hadn't felt in months, maybe years. Peace. The ship docked in Port Stanley, a small town on the northern shore of Lake Erie. Grace walked down the gangplank on shaking legs, her feet touching Canadian soil for the first time. No one stopped her. No one asked for papers. No one tried to claim her as property. She was free, really, truly free. Grace stood on the dock, breathing in the cold air, feeling the sun on her face. Behind her, the lake sparkled in the afternoon light. Ahead of her, a whole new life waited. She'd survived. Against all odds, against every danger, against men with guns and dogs and chains, she'd survived. And now, finally, she could live.